Hi, I'm DJ Sixsmith. You're watching The Sit Down. Oliver Broudy's here with us today. Sensitives, his brand new book, The Fascinating World of Environmental Illness. Oliver, how are you?
I'm pretty good. I'm getting through.
I'm right there with you. And I would imagine that the people that you wrote about in your book are kind of the same way all the time in terms of just getting through, but especially during COVID, I'm sure it's pretty fascinating. So why don't we talk about environmental illness? How did you kind of get exposed to this whole world, and what was it like writing about this whole world?
Okay. Well, I got exposed to it in the summer of 2016. I just sort of randomly stumbled across this community and was immediately fascinated for several reasons. First, because you couldn't really tell whether what they were experiencing was real or not. There was a great deal of debate as to whether this disease or syndrome or whatever you want to call it was a real thing. So there are some scientists and doctors who are saying, yeah, this is totally made up. These folks are just making this thing up. It's all in their head. And then you have people who are actually suffering from it, saying, actually, no. So, and this is sort of one of a subset of diseases. And this is sort of a familiar characteristic of all of them, is that you can't really tell if they're real or not. So, my thought was that if cancer was sort of the defining disease of the 20th century, surely this has got to be the defining disease of the 21st, simply because like so much else in the world we live in now, you can't really tell how real it is. Everyone is kind of living their own experiences and kind of pulling apart from each other, at the same time desperately trying to connect. So at the same time, there are all these people who are actually actively suffering. So in this suffering, no matter what you want to say about the disease, whether it's real or not, is real. The suffering is real. The pain is real. Not only that, but the suffering that they feel is like of a different order. So it's not just like a pain in the leg, but you got to understand, like, so there's a lot of people who suffer from environmental illness, but there's degrees of it. So, you may just have like a sensitivity to perfume or something. You might not like that. You might start feeling tight in the chest if, your company just cleaned your office and used some kind of chemical cleaner on the carpets. But it goes all the way to an extreme where, if you are, let's say that someone puts pesticide on the lawn next door, suddenly you can't think straight, you've got stabbing headaches, you're feeling exhausted. So this is like a different order of sensitivity. And the folks that I were interested in exhibited this kind of sensitivity. And it was to the extent that there was no place that they could really live anymore. So one sort of defining characteristic of them is that they were always moving from one house to the next, trying to find a habitat. And many of them, in fact, were called runners because that's what they did for a lot of their lives. They're just on the run, basically, on the run from civilization in a way. And there's no way they could stop. So a lot of them ended up in, national parks, Walmart parking lots, living out of cars that have been stripped of a lot of the electrical gear and electronics so it wouldn't mess with their heads. So in the end, you've run for so much and you're standing on this tiny little patch of land, maybe the only things you can really tolerate. And in effect, it's like you're living on an alien planet. So, the rest of us are pretty comfortable with our planet. Like we feel like we belong here. And it's hard to imagine what it's like to not feel that way, to feel like you're sort of an interloper in this world where you're just not at home. So there's like an existential tenor to this suffering that immediately captured my attention. Like, oh my God, what the hell is this like? How are these people dealing? So that was one level. And then the second level was, okay, let's look into this. Is this real thing? And how should we think about that? Especially as people who may have loved ones, friends, family who suffer from a disease like this, like how do we deal with them? We want to show them our empathy and our compassion. And then like on the other hand, you've got a doctor or a scientist saying, yeah, it's not real. So what are you supposed to do? If you have a disease like this or you're suffering from it, you're kind of stuck in a way. So that's sort of what drew me into it. All these questions were interesting to me.
Yeah, there's so many different questions to what you wrote about, and really just a sliding scale in terms of how people are impacted, not only physically, but mentally. And like, even when you're on the trip with James, like you start to kind of go through some mental things where you're thinking about the sheets in the hotel and the situation there. So what was it like for you to unpack the mental side of things? Because clearly, like, whether it's the perfume, the pesticides, or, you're on the run, there could be a physical thing, but like, there's a lot of mental warfare going on here, and really like even like a mental prison for some of these people. So what was it like unpacking the mental side of this part?
Well, it's very hard to know what the mix is of the physical and the mental, and part of it is because we don't really have a very good model for understanding still how those two things interrelate. And that was another piece of this book was taking a good hard look at that. In recent years, I think that the medical community has started responding to some of the shortfalls of the medical establishment. You see more like alternative medicine doctors coming out and speaking to people's needs where they're not being met. And there's more sort of an understanding and accommodation for the fact that some of people's sick experiences are not necessarily going to fall neatly into like an insurance code designation. But that shouldn't stop a doctor from trying to understand what the patient is going through and how they can be helped. So part of this is like a question of expertise. I think a lot of the way that we look at phenomena in the world is through the optic of expertise. So it's either medical expertise or psychological expertise or psychiatric expertise or whatever it may be. But and expertise is great. We've obviously suffered from a lack of it in recent years. But at the same time, expertise can be, I think, destructively myopic. There comes a point with some expertise where the expertise starts paying more attention to itself than that which is ostensibly kind of there to figure out.